Hello, my name's Emily. I'm an artist and jewellery maker. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is another instalment of my artist-inspired mason jars. And the artist I'm going to attempt to replicate today is Cicely Mary Barker, who did all of the flower fairies, and she's very iconic for that. I started an initial sketch of the sort of layout that I wanted to do, and I chose sort of almost like a milk bottle, milk urn type jar to replicate within this. And the flower fairy that I chose was actually the Geranium fairy because I just loved the colours, and even in the poem it said vermilion, which I was really feeling. Rather than doing the normal aqua type jar, I decided to go for the more warm greys because that sort of was very present within the painting, so I wanted to kind of keep within that sort of colour theme. So I chose Neutral Tint by Schminke as the darker value because it mixed really well with the warm grey that I chose, which was by Sennelier. And I also chose a handmade watercolour, which was I think Vanilla by AquabloomArt, which was available on Etsy, which I actually got for Christmas, which I thought I would use within this because it was the perfect sort of butterscotch type colour. I then went in with Beyond Indigo's Eucalyptus, and so I had that sort of milky base opacity, and then went in with a mix of the Winsor & Newton Hooker's Green and the Maimeri Blue Green Gold because it gave it that sort of rich liminess that I wanted to have within the eucalyptus shade, but I wanted a bit of transparency as well so it would mix together really nicely because I feel like the style of Cicely Mary Barker was very airy, light, very loose in terms of the depth that was used, and I think that's one thing that I did struggle with this replication is I'm quite heavy-handed, and I think I take a bit too much of a deliberate way of painting, where I think Cicely Mary Barker really worked within that sort of gentle illustrative way of painting, which I think isn't my usual way of painting. I think I am a bit too heavy-handed in that respect, so I think that was one thing I was trying to learn with that, and that's the main reason why I'm doing this sort of project, is because the masters are masters for a reason, and while some masters I think are more reminiscent of the way that I enjoy painting, a bit more kind of impressionistic and probably a bit more heavy-handed as well, but I think it's also testing myself on themes that I'm not as familiar with, like the looseness, like the light-handed approach. It isn't something that I'm familiar with because it isn't the way that I paint, but I want to test myself and learn these skills because I hope it'll give me a more rounded approach with art. I hope it will allow me to recognise what made them so recognised in the artistic movements that they portrayed, and even if it's, say, something that I struggle with, I think it will give me that newfound respect of how art is a very individual thing. There's some strengths that people do, there's some weaknesses that people have, and there's no right or wrong way of doing it, but I hope by doing this project it'll allow me to understand my strengths and weaknesses as well, and what I am more confident in, and to do more of that, but then also work on those weaknesses and see if I can, hone in on that skill and hopefully improve. And here we have the infamous vermilion. Just look at that brightness. And I did use the Schminke vermilion for my choice because it has an element of opacity in the sense of the colour's really rich and vibrant, but you can add that transparency with a bit more water. It's quite a versatile paint in that respect. So I wanted that to be the main colour for the Geranium colours because I think, Cicely Mary Barker in her poem said vermilion, so why would I go against the expert in that respect? I also went in with another Beyond Indigo shade, which was Blood Orange and I think Tangerine Dream, to add a bit more of a orangey burnt aspect to that, just as more of like a overlayer, so there's a bit more variation within the tones, and then added that to some of the wetter paints of the greens as well. One of the greens I also used within the mix of the Maimeri Blue Green Gold and the Eucalyptus and the Hooker's Green was the Roman Schmoll Aquarius green, because it has a bit more granulation to it, so I thought it'd give a bit of a interesting texture within the other greens, but it also does blend out nicely transparent as well, so it's not going to be too noticeable. It'll blend nicely with the other colours. After some much needed drying time, I then went in with the dry media over the top, and I do really love these paints. The way that you can layer over the top of them is really nice. There's no sort of skipping or lumpiness within the texture. It's all very absorbent in this paper. The paper I used is actually from Castell. It's the Castell 300 GSM cold pressed watercolour paper, and I really love their watercolour paper. I think it behaves quite similar to cotton paper without having the price tag of cotton paper. I do really like it. I used my black Faber Castell Polychromo just to really lightly sketch out the values. I wanted to have the darker tones kind of mapped out, so then I know not to go much darker than that. And I think that really helps me kind of keep things from looking too heavy, especially when there's this light-handed approach, which is not my usual style. And then over the top of that black, I went in with the Derwent Coloursoft Grey Lavender, as well as the Faber Castell Polychromo in warm grey and the Caran Luminance pencils in buff titanium and French grey. I felt this gave a neutral tint-like element to the colour palette, which I wanted to keep it relatively cohesive in that respect, and it kept things very light and airy rather than it being too dark, and by blending all these together it made everything really soft and gentle. I wanted to keep the theme very ethereal. I also found the Derwent drawing pencils really lovely to use with this painting as well, because they layer over the top of other pencils really nicely. They're quite almost like a pastel element to them, so they do have a nice opacity to them, and they have some really lovely neutral colours. The one that I'm using currently is Pale Cedar, but I did also go in with the chocolate with the hair, which is a really deep sort of tone, and again they layer and blend really nicely. It was definitely during the dry media, like at this point, when I realised just how heavy-handed I am. I think part of this is because I don't have the grip as easily with my hands with my disability. So I think I go quite heavy-handed almost to overcompensate where I'm going, and that can sometimes make things almost look a bit too heavy, and I'm really going to hopefully try and improve that. So I think by simple measures, like I'm hoping to get maybe something to hold onto with the pencil, so I can feel like I've got the support when holding the pencil, but not having to really compromise on the light-handedness and the mark making. And we actually did this in tattooing as well, so if you had larger pieces or a difficult position of the body that you had to work towards, and especially if it's for a long period of time, like a long session, we were often recommended to use a larger diameter grip because it actually took the pressure off your wrists and your hands. So by doing that, you are more comfortable for a longer period of time. And I think that might also help me now with my wrists and my hands actually being a lot more uncomfortable and a lot more stiff and painful. I think maybe using that sort of technique of having like a larger grip, even if it's just simply using some foam and masking tape just to kind of put over my pencils like a grip, and see if that actually helps with the allowing me to be a bit more light-handed and subtle, but also comfortable while doing so. I was always somewhat heavy-handed in my paintings. I think that's what I have always enjoyed doing. I like the feeling and the process of the pencils and stuff, but I think if I wanted to replicate artists that have that more lighter approach, I think maybe a larger grip to hold on to might eliminate that pain and lack of confidence with holding the pencil, so I can be lighter in my mark making and art generally. Once I got the general gist of the dry media composition, I went back in with wet media, because I think with Cicely Mary Barker's art, I think it has a very playful approach, and I think that is often replicated within layers. And I think working dry media on wet media, dry media on wet media, I think it gives it that sort of mixed media feel. And I think that was something very present in Cicely Mary Barker's illustration. The transparency of the medium is something that is often a lot easier to do with wet media than it is dry media. And I wanted to also, once I had the composition down, I thought I'd go back in with a bit more depth and tone. And by adding the layers of wet media to then go over the top with dry media, it still gives it that very light-hearted, playful approach that I really do enjoy looking at within the Flower Fairy illustrations. It has a sort of sketchbook quality, it has a naivety to it, which I think is really endearing, and I think that's why so many people resonate with it. It's a very innocent, lovely feel to these illustrations, and I think they resonate with a lot of different people of all different ages. I think whether it captures a childhood memory in one's own life or children themselves, the way that they feel when looking at these paintings, to even parents of children can see it through the eyes of their children. I think it captures the hearts of many, many different people, and I think that's why these illustrations have stood the test of time and are still so recognisable, and I really wanted to capture that. I will be listing all of the art supplies that I used within this painting, because I've mentioned some of them, but then some of them I haven't, so I want to make sure that everyone can see what I've used. So if there's anything that did appeal to you, you know what they are. And if you do have any questions specifically on parts of this painting or within this process or anything at all, please do comment, because I don't mind helping people on their way to understanding a bit more about this painting and my process and what I used and whatnot. It was then back in with dry media time, and I used my Caran Luminance Buff Titanium to get the lighter values started, so I kind of knew where I was going with that. And I also decided to get my Caran Neocolors because I thought they would layer really nicely. They also have a water soluble element, so I still kept the kind of wet to dry media feel to this painting, and I just got a bit more of the different contrasting elements within the hair and the face and all of the different sort of botanical elements as well. Going back into the water-soluble elements as well, I used my Derwent Graphitints, which are a graphite pencil with a tint, as the name might suggest. And I think this kind of gave me a bit more of a lenience because I could get the general mark making of the face and stuff and all the elements that I wanted to have a bit more definition. But then if anything needed to be a little bit less harsh, I just add a little bit of water, blend away any of the harshness just to keep the general feel of the illustration very light and airy. It was when doing this particular part where I was outlining with a softer colour where I thought about actually outlining elements of the jar with watercolour, which I do a bit later. And I think that was a big part of this painting, and the learning curve for me was the experimental side of things. I'm learning ways that other artists would work towards their finished piece, which isn't actually necessarily the way that I would do it. And I think by applying those skills, I can then use that in my own artistic toolbox, shall we say. You know, they're the masters for a reason, and I think by doing these projects and learning the ways that they did it, I'm just adding more tools into my toolbox that when I'm doing certain pieces and paintings, I've got more skills, more ways of actually capturing what I want from my pieces. And I think I really am finding the joy within that is more than just actually doing the paintings and appreciating the art from artists that I really am inspired by, but also trying to replicate their style itself is allowing me to learn almost through their eyes in a way. I'm just really appreciating and noticing the value within doing this. And while it's not necessarily something that I am familiar with in terms of being light-handed and illustrative, I'm really enjoying the process of this. And I think it's certainly taught me things I want to learn more about and use in my own artwork. And I think there's nothing more valuable than depth and growth in a skill. It was actually here where I thought about outlining in watercolour because then I can blend it into the other parts of the painting, and it gave me a bit more of a subtlety than outlining with, say, a pen or a pencil. It just gave a bit more of a softness to it, and you could also tailor the opacity a bit more. And I think this is something that I hadn't considered before, that even a darker watercolour could still be used as an outline. And again, it's development of a skill, it's development of the use of a medium, and I think I really enjoyed doing that. And it was here when I was using the neutral tint that I thought, actually, I can blend that into the Neocolors, and the Neocolors being water soluble then blend really nicely, and it's a softness that I think you can't really get when you're using something that isn't as blendable. And I'm really looking forward to developing and using this within my sketchbooks and other paintings as well. So not just finishing a project like this and appreciating the final result, but also the way you got to that result, the skills that you learnt along the way, the things that you can then use onwards and upwards in your artistic journey. I'm just really appreciating more and more about this project. And it's a personal project. It's not something that I'm getting anything out of other than just the sheer joy of art. And I think it's important to have elements of that when your hobby is also partly a career as well. You can lose the love for certain things because you're too busy thinking about the boring stuff that comes with professionalism, like statistics and whatnot. And I think the reason you started this is because you have a love for it, and I'm trying to make sure that by personal projects like this, I'm still keeping the love for it alive, I'm still developing my skill. So when I'm doing the more professional things, I'm not losing that love for it immediately. And I think having a sketchbook and whatnot, and personal projects, there's paintings that I'm doing for people, like commissions and whatnot, but I'm also doing things like this to really learn and develop my skill, and just because I really enjoy it. And there's that start of artwork for me was always the enjoyment and the sheer delight it gives me in creating things like this, and I want to make sure that that's still very much present within my creative endeavours. And after that, it was just the final flourishes to bring everything together. So I started by highlighting to give the impression of things being put more forward, and just for focal points to be more reminiscent of where I want my eyes to go. So it was around the dress, and any highlighted bits around the wings. We'll then balance that out in the composition by having highlighted elements in the geranium leaves and the floral pieces as well. This is my most favourite part of any painting and drawing because I find it the most transformative. It kind of lifts things off the paper. I think it really makes everything look so alive, and it takes that painting or drawing from one level to another, and it kind of just makes it feel finished, and I think it's just a really satisfying part. I tried to keep things very cohesive in the colour story, so I used the Holbein Titanium White acrylic gouache and then used actual watercolours that I'd used within that painting as well, which just tied it in. It gave it a slight tint to the area that I was doing, so then the white that I used where it was just white stood out more. So there were parts of the geranium leaves that here you can see looks relatively highlighted, but it was actually with a slight hint of the eucalyptus green from Beyond Indigo, and then the white was kept for things like the wings and the toes that I've done here. So it just kind of lifts the areas that needed to be very highlighted with the white, but then if I wanted things to be brought forward but not so forward as say the wings, it just gave it a bit more of it lifted it from the area that was being painted, but not to a point of where the white was on the wings. So it just gave it that bit more of layers within the painting. You knew where the eye was going. It gave a sort of route where your eyes are going to go with the painting. So while I wanted elements to be kept very similar to the painting by Cicely Mary Barker, I also was very aware that this was my rendition of it, so I wanted to make sure there were parts I was keeping for the overall composition, trying to see the painting as a finished piece as well. So when taking a step back, I can see it as its finished piece, so I knew then when to kind of dial down elements of highlights, which I'm doing here. I just did a really soft wash of neutral tint over the parts of the white, so it kept things relatively forward at the end of the highlight while still making sure it had a nice gradient of depth from white to dark. Then for the jar, I wanted to highlight the parts where I would think the light was going to be showing, but it ended up looking very stark, which I think didn't fit with the general style of Cicely Mary Barker's Flower Fairy illustration. So I wanted to start off by blending out those white highlights that I initially did with the water-soluble medium I had already on. So for example, the Neocolor 2s in beige and sepia were there, so I made sure that was blended in nicely, and it did give it a little bit more of a subtle wash. And then I went in with a lighter hand, applied just a softer highlight on the bits that were kind of blended out, and it did give it a bit more of a radiant ethereal glow, which is kind of what I wanted to apply to this painting, because it still had that sort of woodland, cottagecore, fairycore element that I wanted to really have present in this painting. With the highlights done, I then wanted to make things stand out a bit further on parts that I wanted to be a focal point. So I used my Sakura PN pen, which has a really fine plastic nib, which is very versatile because you can apply it a little bit thicker on elements when you press a little bit harder, but not to a point where it kind of bleeds or anything. And it has archival ink as well, so it will stand the test of time. But that is the end of this video and the end of another artist jar recreation. I'm really enjoying this project, so look out for more of these. I have a few, well, I say a few, I've got a long list of artists I would like to replicate in jar form, and I hope you join me on this adventure. I'm hoping to eventually turn it into like a zine or a book or something along those lines, because I think it'd be nice to see what I learned and what sort of takeaways I got from each jar and each artist, and I think that would be a really nice format for art geeks like myself. But that's the end of this video. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this video or like me, please subscribe to my channel. I would love to have you here and join me on all of my arty endeavours. I have a couple of videos coming up, and one of them is an art haul because I have been replenishing some supplies and I can't wait to show you these. But that is the end of this video. I really hope you have a truly magical rest of your day. Please stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!